Hello and welcome to Look Down There, the show where we talk about all the things we don't talk about. I'm your host, Michelle Amore. Today, my guest is a sex scholar, a fiction writer, and a spiritual maven. They help people feel healthy and empowered in their sexuality, and they are the brains behind pleasure science. So excited to talk to them today. Please welcome Nadège.
Hi, I'm so excited to be here to talk about vagines. Let's do this.
Vagines and everything in betweens.
Amen.
That should totally be the new tagline. You heard it here first. I love it. Okay, Nadège, I am so curious. What is your journey into scholarly sex? How did you get here?
I didn't do very well in high school. And I went to community college after taking a few years off from school. So when I transferred to university, I was automatically on the track of, I need to write a dissertation, or not a dissertation, a thesis. It takes about 2 years. And I was like, okay, well, what is something I could write about that wouldn't bore me for 2 years? And that was sex. And growing up, I was always the friend people came to. People very often would disclose if they got an STI. I was the person, I was always the one people would share with. And so I also kind of realized as I continued to get older and actually started formally studying sex, that I just had a personality for this industry and for helping people discuss this topic. And it really took off from there.
Mm-hmm. So what was your thesis?
It was called Consensual Obscenity, and it was about BDSM and porn. And I got to go to different porn sites. I specifically targeted feminist porn companies and queer porn companies because my question was, like when we're watching porn, right? If you watch porn, we assume that everything that's happening on camera is consensual. They've agreed to it behind the scenes. And so my question was, how do we really show consent, on these porn films? And especially with feminist and queer porn, which tend to be made by people who aren't men. So there's a little bit of a different intention behind the pornography that's made. I was just really curious about how consent and boundaries were shown in this visual way, because we don't see, the what's happening behind the scenes of, oh yeah, I will totally give you a blowjob, but please don't touch my hair. I don't want to choke on your cock, and these conversations ideally, and for the most part, are happening behind the scenes. And then what you do see on camera usually tends to be consensual. Mainstream porn can be there's a little bit more blurred lines there, but I have to say, sex workers, especially porn performers, are some of the most empowered and, communicative people when it comes to sex. We have so much to learn from this population. And like on a personal note, who doesn't want to go on a porn site and watch hot people bang and then go home and write a paper about it?
Yes. So when you say site, do you mean like the set or you do mean the website?
The set. Yeah. Thank you for, the going to the set. I guess I couldn't go to the website because I'm not, made of codes like the Matrix.
I know. It's like, I don't know what you're talking about. Yeah. I feel like the more that you learn how to advocate for yourself, within sex, within pleasure, I feel like the better you can move through this world. And it's really hard to figure out where your boundaries are. And just something like you had just said, I can blow you, but don't touch my hair. Like, you would think, that everything is fair game because you're performing this act, but it's not that simple. And I feel like when people give access to one thing, it's not access to everything.
Absolutely. And, the other really tough part about boundaries is that, especially when it comes to sex, we realize that our boundaries were crossed because someone crossed them and we didn't know the boundary existed yet. I didn't know that I have a sensitive scalp. And if someone pulls my hair, it hurts and pulls me out of the moment. So it can also be not the most fun experience to discover your boundaries either. And that's okay. I think that's part of the process.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And just having some compassion for yourself in that moment and going, oh, like this is a learning moment and I don't ever want to do that again. And also consent is sexy, right?
Yeah.
So I was watching, I'll admit it, Nadège, I was watching And Just Like That. Have you seen it?
I have not, because I've just heard that it's so bad. And Samantha isn't in it. And Samantha was the reason I watched the show in the first place.
Oh yeah, it needs Samantha very badly.
Yeah.
The show was awful, so awful. And I just had to keep watching it to be like, how awful can it get? Just so much more than I
and
ever
just
thought
like
possible.
that, it got worse.
And just like that, the show is a disaster. But there's this one, it's kind of like a redemption show. Like they try to redeem themselves from everything they did wrong in the first go around. And ooh, is it heavy handed? And it's just like not natural. It's very awkward. And but there's this scene where Carrie, Sarah Jessica Parker, is going out with this new guy and he asks if he can kiss her. And I was like, awesome. That is so great. I'm so happy we're seeing consent. This is so lovely. But then in the next scene, she was like, I don't know. I don't need a contract for a kiss. And I was like, oh, like you just undid everything that was done.
That's so frustrating. And it's so interesting because I haven't watched the show yet, but it's interesting hearing how they're trying to sort of course correct the things that they may not have gotten right. But frankly, when the show did come out, as normative as it was groundbreaking and it pushed the barriers. And I think, I want to give them props for that. Like it was an incredible show when it first came out, even though it was far from perfect. And I think because they weren't perfect, we now know how to adapt and make shows better. But good for them for trying, Yeah.
Okay. So, and just like that, we're moving on.
Yeah.
So, pleasure science. Tell me, how do you define pleasure?
I define pleasure as things that make you feel good. And it's really just that simple. Pleasure is so diverse. The food we eat, the music we listen to, the people that we're around that make us feel good specifically. And then, of course, it's also about sex. And a reason why I chose to use the name pleasure science was because we have such fixed definitions of sex, right? When you think about sex, it's this formula you've been taught of foreplay and then penetration and then orgasm. And sex is so much more diverse and nuanced and unique. You can define it however you want. And it's really about the pursuit of pleasure. So I liked leading with this idea of pleasure science. And, since I studied sex, I try to give as much science-backed approaches to holistic, pleasure-based ways to feel more confident, ways to feel empowered, and take us a little bit away from the word sex and more so on the word pleasure. So that way we have less pressure on ourselves as we explore what are our blocks, why do I experience pain, and figure all of that out.
Where do you find that pleasure and science intersect?
Oh, all the time. I mean, your two biggest sex organs are your brain and your skin, not your vulva, which, by the way, anyone listening, vulva is another word for your vagina. The word vagina technically refers to the birth canal that we can't see. It's the inside of your vagina. So when people say vagina, what they're really meaning to say is vulva, but I'm also a big advocate of calling your genitals whatever the fuck you want. But I like to share that since we're pretty uneducated. And now I forgot the question. This is always... thinking about pussy and then I forget what we're talking about.
That's okay. It happens to all of us. Yeah. So where do pleasure and science intersect?
Right. Intersect.
Yes.
Yeah. All over the place. So like I was saying, your two biggest sex organs are your brain and your skin. So thinking about your brain, right? There's a lot of neuroscience about pleasure, especially now. There's a neuroscientist named Dr. Nan Wise, who just came out with this incredible book called Why Good Sex Matters. I highly recommend it because it's not too academic. I think anybody could read it. But that's just one area right there, learning about how your brain operates on pleasure. And it's very scientific. When it comes to the skin, when we think of trying to heal our sex life, a lot of people think of going to see a sex therapist, which is great because you're going to be communicating about sex, thinking about sex. But another element is seeing a pelvic floor therapist, which is a doctor that specializes in the muscles of the penis, vulva, and everything in between. And then there's also somatic healers, who are people who do just body-based therapies, touch-based therapies, because sex is something that involves touch and your whole body. And another way that, something you learn through the science of pleasure is how your body stores trauma. Right. And so when we're having sex, you could have been in a car accident and something triggered your body, and your body remembers that freeze and fear feeling. And then you're doing sex, someone touches your body in a certain way, and boom, your body's triggered from the car accident you had a few years ago. So, having trauma come up during sex doesn't even need to mean that someone violated you sexually. It could just be that your body is storing trauma. So understanding all of this stuff is where the science of pleasure really comes into play. And I also think it helps us, that, like I said, that sex is a very holistic experience for me. And so I think there's a lot of holistic or quote unquote woo-woo approaches to sex and healing. And a thing I love to do with pleasure science is bring people the science and the research behind why some holistic practices are actually incredibly good for you and might even be healthier than some of our more westernized, medicalized systems. So that's a lot of what I try to focus on with regards to the science of pleasure.
So what happens in the brain when we're experiencing pleasure of any kind?
I mean, all of the feel-good hormones are going off, specifically when you eye gaze or cuddle or touch, oxytocin is released. This is the bonding hormone. Oxytocin is also released, to give you all an idea for anyone who's listening. When a woman or a person with a vagina gives birth to a child, oxytocin is released and bonding the parent to the child. When we orgasm, oxytocin is released, bonding two people together. So the idea that casual sex can be an experience without emotions is just completely false. It's definitely possible to suppress your emotions sexually, and it's definitely possible to have disconnected sex. However, the oxytocin is still being released. We're still going to be having those bonding feelings for people. So that's just
really good to hear, because I've never heard that before. I've never, I've never understood like how it's possible. So thank you for saying that.
Yeah, absolutely. That's one, of many different little things. Another really cool fun fact actually about your brain on pleasure is that pleasure and pain travel through very similar pathways in the brain. So it's one of the reasons why it's totally normal for someone to enjoy a little bit of pain with pleasure. And BDSM and kink is totally normal. And it also, studies show that if you suppress emotional pain, you are also suppressing your ability to experience pleasure, because those pathways are linked, right? So again, feeling our emotions all the way through, very, very important practice. But those are just a couple examples.
I like that. Suppressing emotional pain gets in the way of our pleasure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it's all linked.
Yeah. And I noticed that we also make the same noises, whether we're in pain or in pleasure.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the meaning can be diverse, but the sound can be very similar.
Yeah. It's very primal.
Yes.
Like if you're not performing it, like,
yes, totally.
Yeah.
Which for anyone who's performing during sex, I have been there. I think it's a very normal part of our erotic journeys. Sex is a social behavior, which I don't think we're also taught, and social behaviors we learn through watching other people. Since sex is a private social behavior, we tend to learn how to be sexually quote unquote normal through the films we watch or the porn we watch. So it's super normal for people to, especially at the beginning of their sexual journey, just be performing and trying to figure out, how do I look good and whatnot. And then of course I encourage everyone to get primal, because I think that's where the more genuine sex can happen and the feel good feelings can happen, is when we give ourselves permission to just sort of be animalistic.
Yeah. And I've definitely fallen into the trap of like, everything should be like movie sex where it's just perfect and beautiful. And like, we don't have to talk about what we want because you know me so well that you know what I want. And why should I even have to tell you?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. Fallacies.
Yeah. Totally fake. No one is a mind reader.
Yes. So what are some other blocks that we have in experiencing pleasure of any kind?
I think, the first thing to recognize is that our relationship with pleasure from the time we are children is introduced through the lens of shame. If we even take a step back from sex, which your first introduction to sex usually has to do with shame, but even thinking about eating and the pleasure of eating, that is something that is shamed as well. So I'd say right off the bat, recognizing what shame is coming up, where you were taught that, what incentivized someone else to say, oh, masturbating the way you are, you're masturbating too much. Well, maybe that's their belief. They were raised in a religious household or something. And that doesn't have to be something you carry with you, and you can challenge that. So I'd say starting there is really powerful.
Yeah. And it's also the idea that we feel like we should like something, or we shouldn't like another thing, or like everybody, it seems like everybody likes this and I don't like that. And, then we would like force ourselves to endure some kind of socially acceptable pleasure that doesn't do anything for us. So we're following other guidelines rather than our own guidelines.
Totally. Which reminds me of just like the whole purpose of your podcast and looking down there and feeling comfortable with the vagina or the vulva. I remember growing up when I first started being sexual with men, cisgendered men in particular. Something I heard all the time was, oh, I really want to go down on you, but don't tell anyone. Don't tell anyone that I like that. I don't want people to know that I like that. And that it was like normal for these men or these boys, we were teenagers, but it was normal for these guys to be like, well, I like that and I want to give you that pleasure, but don't tell anyone because I'll be embarrassed.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah. The only time I'd ever heard of that, I know it's another TV show with The Sopranos. There's a character in the show who liked eating pussy, and he totally got found out and was made fun of and shamed and all of that. And I really didn't know that was a thing.
Oh yeah. No, I heard that. I want to say at least 3 times.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah. Some of the things, as I'm doing this podcast and I'm exploring other projects and talking about this with people, some of them men, they don't actually know that we vulva owners struggle with accepting our vulvas. Like when I say this, they're like, what? Like that has been their reaction 9 out of 10 times.
Wow.
That they have no idea. And for me, it's what I'm in, it's what I'm exposed to, it's the things I talk about. So I figure, everybody knows that, but they don't know that. And I just had a conversation last night with someone, and he brought up something that I thought was really interesting, that he said, yeah, I had no idea that vulvas look different.
Oh my, it's so diverse.
Yeah. And he said, I was with somebody and I was like, oh, this is very different, And so imagine how that person felt and what they're holding on to from that experience. But also how sad is it that guys don't know. They don't know
No.
that there's diversity because they don't see diversity
No, I
in
mean,
vulvas.
there's literally a thing called porn star pussy. And it's like where, the quote unquote ideal vagina is one where the lips are going to be thicker and cover the hole entirely, be clean shaven or fully waxed, and it's really interesting because that is not how vaginas look. I mean, that's how some of them look, but vaginas are so diverse. And I love to think about orchids, the flower orchids, because orchids look a lot like vaginas. And there's over 30,000 different breeds of orchids. And of the 7 most expensive flowers in the world, 3 of them are orchids. So pussies are like orchids. They're diverse, they're beautiful, they're rare. They should be doused with all the money. They're luxurious, most expensive flowers in the world. Amen. But it's so true. There's for anybody listening who's like, I didn't know vaginas were diverse, or I think I have a weird looking vagina. Google the Vagina Project or the Vagina Photo Project. There's literally just photos online that photographers have taken of all different kinds of vulvas. And it's really beautiful. It's really self-esteem building because we get to see that we just look so diverse. I mean, think of how diverse nipples and chests and breasts are, like even start there. And then why would we think that, and then how diverse penises are, faces are. Why would we think that the other area of our body is just supposed to look some sort of way?
Yeah, well, we don't know. We're so disconnected, and it's hard to see through the shadows of shame.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So on that note,
yeah,
that we're all trying to pursue pleasure. Well, maybe we're not all trying to pursue pleasure, but we know that pleasure is something that makes us feel good. And we might all have a desire to pursue pleasure.
Yeah.
It's in all of us. Yeah. But why do you think that we condemn those that provide or pursue pleasure?
Oh, that is such a great question. I mean, I think part of it is trying to suppress, sovereignty and autonomy amongst people. I think communities, people are easier to control when they're, more in a structure, and it's such a good question. Now you have my brain popping into so many different areas.
Yeah. But, I'll tell you where it came from. I am in this movie, the short film where I play a dying courtesan, and I previewed it this week. And the whole thing, it's a short documentary about courtesans. And so that's just the question that popped in my mind as I was watching it, because these women provided a pleasure.
Yeah.
And courtesans weren't necessarily condemned. They were actually celebrated, but it's like their stories are being rewritten to show the condemnation, to show that, they pursued this life of pleasure and then they died,
absolutely.
And then they lost everything, So it's like, we always have to we glorify and then we squash down. And totally. What is our obsession with that, with doing that?
I think it is a way to control populations, because if you think about childbirth, if you control birth, then you control the population. If you control the population, you control the economy. So there's, financial benefits to making people not feel sexually empowered and policing people's sexuality. And what's really fascinating is I don't think there's 1 or 2 or 3 people at the top 1% actively thinking, how can we control sexuality? I think it's that our society has for so long tried to understand how to bring communities together and put them in line, whether it's a religious community, a tribal community, a global community. And in order to do so, we try to figure out how to control other people. And controlling sex is a very potent thing, because if you don't feel comfortable in your sexuality or as a sexual being, think of how many other areas of your life that bleeds into.
Mhm.
So it is, and that can sound very conspiracy theory-esque, but I do see proof of that everywhere. And I think it's definitely not a coincidence that we glorify and then shame sex workers or people who have the audacity to feel sexually empowered. It's a really horrible cycle that we have as a culture that we've made normal and that we expect and we participate in.
Yeah, we participate unknowingly
Yeah.
and without consent, right?
Yep.
Like we're just a part of, like, we're all living in the same soup. Like it's mucky, and we have people like us and other people we know who are trying to get out of the pot and bring other people with us, and spread the good word of good, healthy sex.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So there's so much,
There's
so much to talk about in what you just said. But, I do feel that like sexuality, eroticism is the undercurrent to who we are as humans.
Yeah.
I think it's the undercurrent to our spirituality.
Yeah.
And that when you're not connected in that way, like in your roots, it's hard to do anything. It's hard to move through the world in any kind of real way where you are experiencing the world, experiencing pleasure. It's harder to focus. It's harder to give attention. It's harder to have good relationships.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
But it is easier to control people.
Yes, it is. Yeah, because you're totally detached from this whole massive universe inside of you.
Yep, absolutely. And less likely to advocate for yourself, less likely to question the status quo, And again, I don't think people are bad for doing this. I think we all, we all participate in it. Whether it's just the things we gossiped about in high school. Like I remember going back to, loving your vulva, like when high school, the girls, and I participated in this too, we would gossip about who was shaving their legs and who wasn't. It was a big topic. And if someone one of the girls wasn't shaving their legs, we'd be like, oh, notice that Susie hasn't shaved her legs. And then that grew into who's shaving their vagina. Do you have pubic hair yet? So, and it became really interesting because looking back on that time, it was like, the girls started to become a little obsessive with like, who has pubic hair? Because that means you're a woman, you're more mature. But then again, if you have pubic hair, it must be removed. God forbid it's there. So it was this interesting, like, I want the rite of passage. I want to have a little bit of hair down there, but I only want it so I can get rid of it, And thinking again, like when we're grooming ourselves, who are we grooming ourselves for? What have we been taught about these beauty standards? I mean, there's vagina beauty standards.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. And I lost what I was going to say because no, I do remember. And I definitely was a part of that too, growing up, and even in beyond high school. Like I'm not even going to let it stop in high school. It is a cycle that took hold of me, and I definitely shamed other women and shamed pussies, but that all stemmed from my own shame and my own need for healing. And I think just shame is contagious. And I think if we're feeling that, then we're going to put it onto someone else, because if we don't feel good, we may not even know we don't feel good. We may not even know why we don't feel good, but we're going to put it on someone else who we see as pursuing pleasure.
Absolutely. Because, sex and pleasure, they activate people. And going back to that question you had of like, why do we, shame courtesans, sex workers, or anyone who has the audacity to try and be sexually liberated? I think as a culture growing up, it is so much more familiar to feel shame and to just feel shame around sex. That's what's familiar. And so when we're confronted with someone who, maybe they're just an Instagram influencer, but they love being in their bra, they love talking about like their vulva, their whatever. And that can activate us in a way that makes us be like, well, fuck this person. Who do they think they are? I want to put them back in their box. I want them to stop talking about this. And so, these things, and that's, if you relate to that experience, I say that because I've done that, I think we all have. It's a good moment to take a step back and realize, oh, I'm being activated. I'm being triggered. What's going on here? What am I afraid of? What am I threatened by? It can be very threatening to meet people who are comfortable and confident in themselves, because again, it's usually just not what's familiar. Growing up, it's more familiar to feel shame about it, not talk about it, get embarrassed, I think a lot of it roots from as well when we're young and just being embarrassed by something that happened in the locker room. I bet no one else remembers it, but you remember it. And that embarrassment will stay with us. And again, stay in our body. Your bodies really hold on. When we're embarrassed, our whole muscles tense. It can be a traumatizing experience. So there's so many reasons, all of that.
Yeah. Yeah. And I don't think we give our bodies enough credit, because our bodies are really intelligent. And I think we have this relationship with our bodies that they're servants to us. Like they must just do exactly what we want when we want them to do it.
Yes.
And we don't give them any kind of autonomy, right?
Totally.
We don't listen to them. We ignore them. We shut down feelings. We shut down sensations.
Yeah.
And, and then our body's like, oh, really? You're not listening? Oh, well, I'm going to make you listen now.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think a powerful exercise is to just try to build trust with your body. Mm-hmm. And that takes years, by the way, again, it's not a quick fix. Like these things are lifelong journeys, but it is possible to heal from trauma, and it is possible to feel really empowered with sex. It's possible to go from not having orgasms ever to start having orgasms. So I also like to share that because it can feel so discouraging, I think, sometimes to talk about trauma, sex, and all of these things, but that we forget it is possible to heal, and there is hope, and you can have an orgasmic life. And that's beautiful.
Yeah. But it is important to note, like you said, it's not easy. It takes years. It takes years of unlearning. It takes years of self-reflection. And also the thing that I found that really helps when you're trying to affect this kind of change is having support around you, whether that be with people or just by consuming good books or listening to good podcasts that support you in this, because that is something that you would have to intentionally do, because the world is not set up for your healing.
Absolutely.
The world actually would prefer if you don't.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Totally. And, going back to the neuroscience of pleasure, when you surround yourself by people who support you or listen to things that make you feel supported and see, unfollow people on Instagram or mute people on Instagram that just don't make you feel good for whatever reason, your brain chemistry literally changes. You produce more gray matter, and gray matter helps us process emotions. So when we're surrounded by people, maybe your family is just a little intense and you happen to be around them a lot and you're hearing these messages all the time, you're going to have less gray matter. Your brain chemistry will change, and you won't have as much capacity to process your emotions, which is one of the key factors of healing trauma, right? Is being able to process those emotions. So what you were saying, it sounds like such a simple no-brainer, but actually it's one of the most powerful things that you could be doing for free right now.
Yep, exactly. Yeah. And you mentioned family, and I had just, I've come back from a family visit a few weeks ago, and it takes me a few days, maybe even a week or so, to kind of like get rid of that muscle memory, because it just goes right back, and I feel all those things that I felt when I was growing up, and all these things that I'm actively trying to heal from and move away from, and then I'm back in it, and it's like, whew, it's a lot to process, but it's interesting how you can so easily slip into that. So that's why I think it's so important to have those additional support systems and positive reinforcement when you're entering into this kind of healing work.
Totally. And I think also give yourself the time to grieve, like you knowing that, oh, I'm going to see my family and it's going to take me anywhere from 3 to 7 days to bounce back. That's also just erotic wellness right there. That's knowing your body, knowing what you need, taking the time to grieve and just respecting your process. That's also powerful. Even if it's like, well, I don't want to be sad for a week. Well, it's hard to go back and visit family, and there's power in the pauses. Let yourself be sad, feel those emotions, and know that you also have a system in place, whether it's maybe you don't have the friendships right now that are supportive, but you can listen to a podcast like this one. You can read a good book. You can find community and things like that, and just set yourself up for success for when the grief period is over. You have other resources to start building yourself back up as well.
Yeah. I really like you said that power in the pause. And that's something that I grew up playing music, and they always said music happens in the rest. And I always love that. If you think about music, if everyone's continually playing the whole time and no one takes a break, it's not music, it's just noise. So I like that life happens in the pauses. There's power in that. Beautiful.
Yeah.
Nadège, thank you so much. This has been so fun. I love talking to you.
I'm so glad. I love talking about this topic, and you have such an amazing experience. Like I love burlesque. I love dancing. Seeing people dance is one of my favorite things. So burlesque is just like this erotic dance on top of it. I'm obsessed.
Yay. All right. Well, maybe I'll dance for you someday.
Love it.
All right, Nadège, tell us where we can learn more about pleasure science and all the things you have going on.
Absolutely. So we host erotic wellness soirees and events that are basically sex ed parties for adults. I'm based in Los Angeles, so feel free to follow me at Pleasure Science to stay up to date on that on Instagram. And then you could go to pleasurescience.com as well to see all the things that we're doing. Look up our articles. Our blog is on Medium, but you can go to pleasurescience.com and click on the article link and start reading up on all the sexy things. And actually, just another freebie for anybody listening, I have a line of erotic astrology ebooks that teach people about their erotic strengths based on their astrology sign. So for anyone listening, you can use the code look down there for 20% off and find your astrology sign. And other than that, I hope to see people around the interwebs, the wild, wild interwebs.
Well, okay. So I'm going to go and get those books. Where can you can find the books on your site?
Yes. Go to pleasurescience.com/shop and they'll be there.
Awesome. Oh, that's so generous of you. Thank you. That's a nice surprise.
Absolutely. I love surprises.
Okay. Is that because you're a Sagittarius? Is that right?
It is. Mm-hmm. And I think that is why I like surprises. Yep.
Yes. All right, my dear. Thank you. Everybody, it's time for you to spread your legs and spread the love. Go and follow Nadège at Pleasure Science. And you can follow us at I Look Down There or me at Michelle Amore. And don't forget about our Pleasure Positive virtual event happening on April 2nd. It's called Into Pleasure, and we're featuring 5 amazing presenters presenting on so many different topics that will lead you on your pleasure pursuits. So check it out at intopleasure.com, and that's happening on April 2nd. And finally, remember, confidence comes from the bottom up. So grab a mirror and look down there. Until next time.